Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We'll probably wait a minute or two while we have participants join the webinar. Thank you so much for being here. All right, I know we're still waiting for some participants to join today's webinar, but we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. We're so thrilled to be presenting today's panel entitled Change a Life, Make an Impact, Immigration Pro Bono Reflections and Opportunities. Today's webinar is sponsored by the ABA Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and Commission on Immigration. My name is Laura Peña, and I serve as Pro Bono Counsel for the ABA Commission on Immigration. This week is National Celebration of Pro Bono Week, and even during this historic and challenging time, it is so important that we pause to reflect about what an incredible impact the legal profession can make in this world. Before we begin, I am so pleased to have the immediate past president of the ABA, Judy Perry Martinez, here with us today to provide welcoming remarks. Thank you so much for being here today, Judy.
Well, thank you, Lara, and thank you to all the panelists who have joined us today, as well as today's attendees for this important conversation about the great work of volunteer attorneys and the impact that we can make as we celebrate National Pro Bono Week and beyond. The National Celebration of Pro Bono actually was established in 2009 in response to the Great Recession. And today, the ramifications of the pandemic, as with the 2009 recession, make the need for access to justice and pro bono legal services even more critical. So as we have our conversation today, it's important for us to acknowledge the tireless efforts and contributions of so many, not only attorneys, but attorneys and administrative staff and paralegals and others who work together as a team in delivering the services that are needed by so many. I can tell you that it is up to all of us to address not only this current crisis, but what happens all year long in terms of the need for legal services by so many across our country. The ABA has long been active in immigration-related policies and activities, including our immigration justice programs at the borders. This webinar will help us learn the kind of work and volunteerism that's going on with ABA ventures such as ProBAR and the Immigration Justice Project, as well as with the Children's Immigration Law Academy. My personal pro bono experiences in the immigration arena have given me insights and understanding that, frankly, I would not have gained had I not had the privilege of working shoulder to shoulder with Lyra and Brenda and so many others in our work to really try to save and change lives. Your pro bono experiences, I know, will do the same, whether they're at the border or in your own community, where there's such a dire need for pro bono services as well. The panel assembled today is a wonderful group of individuals who have demonstrated their commitment to pro bono and to really making sure that we have the volunteer lawyers we need to represent asylum seekers who are detained in U.S. immigration detention centers and elsewhere, trying to get through the processes that are before them. Their personal accounts will underscore just how vital pro bono work is, particularly during this challenging time. So for resources on existing and emerging issues relative to the legal profession, I want you to take a look because it will help you as you practice within this COVID time. At ABA's Practice Forward, there you'll find a lot of tools that can help with remote work and other things that you'll need to do in order to engage in pro bono right now. As Ibram Kendi wrote in the most recent issue of The Atlantic, a nation is what it does, not what it originally claimed it would be. I'm so proud to stand with these dedicated lawyers and professionals who are doing. They are defining what our nation does and not allowing others to do so, nor resting on what those long ago originally claimed our nation would be. So thanks to all of our panelists, thanks to the extraordinary staff at both IJP and ProBAR, and of course at CELA. The ABA is so very proud of all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. Really appreciate you being here today and providing those words. Now, a little roadmap for today's webinar. We are going to have a couple of conversational style interviews with our pro bono volunteers, and then we will hear a bit about one of the ABA's projects, which Judy just mentioned, the Children's Immigration Law Academy. At the end of the panelists' speaking opportunities, then if we have time, we will be able to do some Q&A. Now, during today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not through the chat function. If you don't see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. That could help. We will address questions either through the chat function directly, or as I mentioned, if there's time at the end of today's panel. In addition, just in case you want to go back and review the panel, you're not able to sit through the entirety, we will be sharing a recording of the program to everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. Now, brief introductions of our panelists. We have Rosemary Hollinger with us today. She is the founder of Partner Up LLC and a professional and leadership coach. Like me, Rosemary is a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center, and I will dare say she's a little later in her career, which has been hallmarked by fascinating legal experience as a trial lawyer in a legal aid setting, private practice, and also as a federal government trial attorney handling complex financial matters. She has volunteered on a variety of case matters with the Immigration Justice Project in San Diego, California. We also have Dan Owsley here with us today. Dan is an associate at Simpson Thacher in New York City. He's a graduate of Columbia Law School. I would categorize Dan as a little earlier in his career than Rosemary, but his pro bono service has been just as impactful. And Dan is here today to share his pro bono experience with ProBAR in South Texas, where his firm recently won protection for an LGBTQ client in removal proceedings. We have Laura Egan also with us today. Laura is a senior staff attorney with the ABA's Children Immigration Law Academy. You'll learn more about CELA and their pro bono platform later in today's webinar. Last but not least, we have Christopher Kai Medeiros. Kai is a staff attorney with the ABA's Immigration Justice Project, located in San Diego, California. IJP was founded in 2008, and you'll hear more about IJP and its mission from Kai shortly. Now, one last bit of background information before turning it over to our first panelists. Earlier this year, the ABA Commission on Immigration entered into a partnership with the Immigration Justice Campaign. At a strategic level, we realized that our two projects, which provide legal services, that's IJP in San Diego and ProBAR in South Texas, they really lack the capacity to mentor pro bono attorneys on the complexities and constantly shifting dynamics of what it takes to represent an individual in removal proceedings. The Justice Campaign is an initiative of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and the American Immigration Council. They have developed a state-of-the-art training program and process to provide mentorship to pro bono attorneys who work with their partner projects. This partnership has been a game changer, and it has helped us be even more confident in delivering a pro bono experience that is not only meaningful and sometimes life-changing for the client, but where the volunteer feels supported and engaged the entire time. Rosemary will talk a little more about what her experience has been like working with the ABA's Immigration Justice Project and also being mentored by the Justice Campaign. Now, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Kai and Rosemary.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura. My name is Kai Medeiros. As Laura mentioned, I am a staff attorney at the ABA's Immigration Justice Project, or IJP, located in San Diego. IJP, as Laura said, was founded in 2008, and today we've grown to be an office of roughly a dozen employees, both attorneys and support staff alike. We represent detained non-citizens. We're one of the main legal service providers at the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is in turn one of the larger ICE detention centers. It's located near the San Ysidro port of entry, which is one of the largest ports of entry in the United States. We represent detained non-citizens before immigration judges, before the Board of Immigration Appeals, and increasingly before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And one of the things that most distinguishes IJP, we feel, and what we're here to talk about today, is the robust pro bono program that we've established since our inception in 2008. And that is, of course, what we're going to be talking to Rosemary about today. And I guess I want to start with Rosemary. I understand that you've taken 3 pro bono cases through IJP, and I want to hear about all of them. And so I was wondering if you could start by telling us about the first client that you took and what representing that person entailed.
Okay, my first client was a young man from Honduras, and he was at high risk for COVID-19 because he had asthma, and he was incarcerated at Otay Mesa. Unfortunately, while we were pending, he contracted COVID-19, so that more or less delayed things because they weren't about to release him while he was still sick. So what I was asked to do was to do a parole release. It was my first experience doing immigration work. And it was a little frightening for me at first because I came from a totally different background. And I have to say that as I walked through the process of doing a parole release, having the support, the online support, which sort of, because there's a guide and it's a step-by-step, it's like a cookbook. You just sort of follow the steps one by one. And then having the support of the mentor, which I'm sure we'll talk about some more, it gave me the confidence to do what I needed to do. And I had access to have all of my questions answered. The parole release process, it goes to a detention officer. These are non-lawyers. So actually rules of evidence don't apply. And it's just like writing basically an opinion letter, if you think about it. And that was, as at first, so really what you're doing is you're gathering all the facts and getting all the papers together and then putting together a compelling story that a layman would understand. And so after I did going into it, it seemed intimidating, but once I was done, it's like I had all my templates. I was like ready to go into my second one, which is I took the first one. It took me about 3 weeks to do it, and then I was ready to do the next one.
And where did things end up with that parole application with your first client?
Oh, the first one, so they denied it, even though I thought I was correct on the law. And then it was really weird. About 6 weeks later, I got a panicked phone call from the detention officer. And just give a little perspective, this is a man who never returned a phone call the entire time I was doing the parole release. And I would call him like every week to nudge him along to rule on it, and he never responded. And then all of a sudden, panicked phone call, you've got to get your client out of here and you have 3 days. And we had to scurry like everything because he had already denied it. And then 6 weeks later, panicked phone call, got to get him out of there. And then we did. And he was, he's now with a sponsor living in Iowa.
That's incredible. That must have been such a feeling of accomplishment knowing that he left the detention center because of the application you filed. So now I'd like to know about the second client that you took on and what representing that person entailed.
Okay, I'll just to add about that feeling. he had said to me, because I stayed in contact with him, that he thought he was going to die in the detention center from COVID-19, that he would get it again and he would die. And so when he was released, it was an extraordinary feeling. The second client, also from Honduras, and he is one of these parents who was separated from his child. He was fleeing gang violence. He took his 14-year-old son, who's also fleeing gang violence because the gang was trying to recruit him. And they crossed the border and were detained, but they were separated. And it was October 2nd. And they were separated, and the father had no contact with his son for 40 days. His son was in a juvenile detention facility. At the end of the 40 days, they came to him and said, if you'll sign away your rights to your son, we will put him in foster care and he'll be able to stay in the United States until he's 18. I was horrified when I heard this story because I'm thinking about things about duress and the like, and whether or not that was a truly voluntary signing away of parental rights. It was very eye-opening because actually my client had a totally different view of the situation. After his son was placed with the foster family, he had weekly contact with his son. His son is now going to school and getting the education he always wanted in a safe setting. So from my client's point of view, his son was in a good place, and he didn't want anyone to upset that. He just wanted to be released from custody. He was also having health issues, but not the standard CDC COVID-19 issues. So we needed to find a doctor who was willing to write a declaration for him in a non-standard kind of way. And it was great because the staff who were backing us up every step of the way, the IJP staff, I think, I have to say I'm not always great remembering who's IJP and who's IJC, but I think it was IJP staff, were terrific. They gave me a list of 9 medical schools that had faculty who were willing to write these affidavits for us. I reached out to all 9 of them. 2 responded, and then ultimately 1 wrote a fantastic declaration supporting humanitarian needs for why he should be released. So we did. So for him, I ended up doing 2 petitions for parole release and 1 pending motion for bond because he was denied bond in the spring. I should mention, I did an appeal for the first client. I didn't do the appeal for the second client because they were due at the same time. And so another volunteer did the appeal, but we coordinated.
And when you say you did the appeal for the first client, was that an appeal of his deportation and asylum case?
Yeah, it was an appeal of the order of removal. It was pretty egregious. So we did it basically on a lack of due process. The hearing, which was amazing to me, the judge swore him and his girlfriend under oath and then tendered them for cross-examination. There was no opportunity to put a case on at all.
And that appeal is pending still today?
That appeal is still pending.
All right. And then with client 2, your request for release is also pending?
Yeah, that is still pending. It was just assigned to a judge this morning. It has not yet been set for hearing. But we've been briefing it back and forth.
And now I'd like to know about your third and final and most recent client that you've taken on and what you've done to represent that person and what that experience has been like.
So my third client is African. He is from Mauritania. That was a huge experience for me because I don't think I'd ever really heard about Mauritania, and I didn't know the history there. Mauritania only banned slavery in 1981. They still project that about 5% of the population is enslaved. My client is from a different group. He is from what's called Black Africans. They were not enslaved, but they're an ethnic group that the predominant white Moor ethnic group is trying to get rid of. So there have been a lot of refugees coming out of Mauritania due to violence along the southern border with Senegal. And now they're still attempting to dispossess them. So my client was tortured by the government officers, beaten with sticks, thrown down a well, and a variety of other things. And finally, he fled for his life. He had a long trip to the United States because he flew from Mauritania to Brazil. And it sounds like he walked and hitchhiked his way from Brazil to the Mexican border. And he was apprehended as he and his companions crossed the border. And so he was within 300 feet of the border when he was apprehended. So he's been in custody now, I think, for 10 months. I did a parole release for him, and I did a bond hearing for him on Friday, and that's been great. And then I'm going to help him to do his asylum application.
And so it sounds like those three cases have really called for a pretty wide range of skills, right? From courtroom advocacy in the bond hearing to appellate briefing in that first case to what sounds like much more informal advocacy with the ICE officer for the parole requests. Can you comment on the various skill sets that this work called on or called for, and tell us if there's one aspect that stuck out to you as perhaps the most enjoyable?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, the first one is it took me really took me back to my early years of practice, because I was investigating the facts, coordinating with the sponsor, and just getting all of the paperwork put together to tell a compelling story about why a sponsorship would be a good thing and would assure that he would not become a public charge, a risk to the community, a risk of flight, those kinds of things. So, that was just investigation in cooperation with other agencies. Same thing when I was working with the doctors to get the supportive declarations and things like that. So that was like fact gathering, which is pretty basic, and then writing a letter, and then coming to the realization that this letter didn't really have to comport with blue booking, or it wasn't really a legal, so much of a legal document as much as a persuasive document. So once I kind of got that all under control, that was a very basic level that very early in my career would have been easy to do, and it was certainly easy to do now. As you got into the motion practice with the bond court, then you're dealing with the standards of administrative law. And I did a lot of administrative law, both as a legal aid attorney and then as a government attorney. So that was pretty easy. It was just a matter of trying to learn a new language and new cases and the specifics. But our general law background I pretty quickly figured out that a lot of things were the same. It's just some of the specifics that weren't. And having Ilana, my mentor, there to support me every step of the way and point me out the right cases. And then there are templates and models online. It became very easy once you get sort of over that initial fear. And the hearing was a little interesting because I'd never done a telephonic hearing before.
And so, this is the bond hearing for client number 3, right, that you just had?
Yeah, on Friday. And the challenge with a telephonic hearing is you can't see the judge. So when the judge got impatient with me, as she did, I had no sense of it, and I just kept going. And I think even if I'd known she was angry, I wouldn't have waived all the things she tried to get me to waive. And I think in a sense, it's almost easier to stand your ground when you can't see the expression on the judge's face.
And how did that hearing end up? What did the judge end up holding?
So she gave him bond, which was good. The government attorney had recommended $5,000 bond, and the judge went with $8,000, which was not a happy occasion for me, but we think he may be able to raise it.
I hope that that's right. And
yeah, I hope so too.
And so of those sort of different matters that you worked on and the various skill sets that you employed, does anything jump out to you as your favorite or what you got the most out of doing?
Well, I actually love doing the appeal. And I think that the reason I love that is I felt like a real lawyer again. I haven't written an appeal in a really long time, and this was a due process appeal, and so the issue was pretty easy to understand, and the argument was pretty compelling. I mean, it's pretty basic. He should have had an opportunity to put his case on, and getting no opportunity to put your case on is pretty basic. Actually, it was pretty shocking. And so some of that moral outrage, I'm sure, channeled through the brief. But it was, there is a lot of fun to taking the law and the facts and putting it together and making a coherent story and theory, and then turning out something that you look at it and you go, hey, this is pretty good. So I really did enjoy doing that.
Well, and I think you've convinced me that what you're describing seems like it strikes at the heart of the due process guarantee in immigration court. And yeah. I hope that the BIA agrees with us both. So now I want to turn to a little bit more of the details where the rubber meets the road in taking pro bono cases. And you've alluded a couple times to receiving mentorship through IJP's partnership with the Immigration Justice Campaign, or IJC. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about the support that you received from their mentorship program and how that was distinct from the support you received from my organization, the ABA's Immigration Justice Project? Right.
So I believe that what I was getting from IJP was the online resources and actually staff backup at times, which I needed because I'm not with a firm. But IJC's mentorship was amazing. And putting it in the context of all the social isolation that we're feeling during this time, and then, taking this leap as basically a solo practitioner and taking a leap into an unfamiliar area of law is scary. And it was certainly scary to me. And having my mentor was, her name is Alana. Having Alana there every step of the way was great. So the mentor has, I believe they both operate this way. They have office hours 3 days a week at a designated time. So for my time zone, it's 9 to 10 in the morning. I think it's obviously later in other time zones. And you can just go, and if you have, and you get you sort of in a queue, and she runs through the queue, and whatever questions you have, she very patiently answers the questions and provides support and resources. But the other thing that was happening that I don't think anyone really expected is we started to kind of hang out. This is the best way I can describe it, because you would listen to what other people were facing and what their issues were. And then sometimes we would have conversations. Multiple participants would say, well, I had that, and this is how I handled it. And then, so then what ended up happening is we sort of became a community and a team. And I thought that that was, to me, I really think that it was great because it overcame the social isolation. Some of us communicated with each other and helped each other outside of the mentoring program. So so we were there to support each other. And I think that was really great, because certainly IJC planted the seeds that then created a larger community.
And I'm glad that you brought up that you're that you're a solo practitioner, because I did want to ask if you have any thoughts about how that made your pro bono experience different than, for example, if you worked for a larger law firm.
Well, I do think if you're with a larger law firm, you have colleagues that you can go to and ask questions. And here I was, and so I'm an experienced trial lawyer. There's no question about that. But I am out here by myself. When I was with the government, I had a staff with 32 other lawyers that I could go to when something unique came out. And here I was trying a new area of law, and I didn't have that kind of support. But it turned out that I did, and that made it really easy. And if something happened, outside of office hours, oftentimes Alana would get the email and respond, but sometimes some of the other team members did too. And so that really made me feel more confident in what I was doing. And as you're feeling more confident and more supported, then you're willing to take on more and more cases, which is what I've been doing, obviously.
That sounds like a wonderful network you developed, and I'm sure, particularly at a time when we all want to feel like we're going through this together. And I know that taking these cases can at times feel daunting or isolating. So I can only imagine how helpful it was to feel that you could reach out to other people who are experiencing a similar thing. So keeping with the sort of more practical considerations, I know that sometimes volunteer attorneys are nervous about how they'll be able to communicate with their clients, particularly if they do not have a language in common. So how did you navigate that?
Okay, so I knew my first two clients were Spanish speaking, and I can speak Spanish to some extent, but I also know that dialect is a problem for me anyway. And at first, when I first started the first two, I lined up private people I knew. Both were Mexican background, so they were speaking Mexican Spanish, and actually, the first client, his dialect was so hard that even native speakers were having a problem with him. The second client, his Spanish was less dialect, so even I could understand him. So we started out that I was relying on people that I had connected with, but as that case moved on, I think IJP entered into some kind of an agreement. So they had a list of translators who were available at certain times. And then I would arrange to have my client, particularly the one I didn't understand, call only when a translator was available. And what we would do is he would call the translator and the translator would merge me into the call. And then the last client speaks Pular and IJP.
Is your client from Mauritania?
Yes, from Mauritania. And they connected me right away with a translator who's a former Peace Corps volunteer. And she's very, very good. And what we worked out with her, what works best for the two of us is that we generally don't have three-way conversations. If I have questions, I send them to her ahead of time and she gets me the answers. If he has questions, vice versa, because he tends to call on these 10-minute calls. And so if we only have 10 minutes to do it, that's a much more efficient way to do it. My clients like to talk a lot. So I get a lot of these 10-minute calls. Those are the ones that they initiate and pay for. The attorney calls can seem to be able to go for an hour, but I have to initiate them. And I don't seem to have the same need to talk to them as much as they have a need to talk to me.
So the last question that I want to ask you is what's really a two-parter. One, I want to see if there are any big picture takeaways that you could leave us with based on your experience taking these three cases. And then also, if there's anything you would tell somebody who is perhaps considering taking a pro bono immigration case, but maybe feels a little intimidated and is on the fence.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, I'm late in my career and a lot of people I know have retired and they want to do volunteer work. And like I was talking to one of my friends and she explained to me, and she's a lawyer, and that whatever she was volunteer activity she was doing, she was passing out brochures at a grocery store. And I'm like, really? I mean, you're not, so you want to be passing out brochures at a grocery store or trying to get a detainee out of custody? And I was like, think about how, really, where are your talents best used? So if you're looking for meaningful volunteer work and where you're going to make a difference in somebody's life, I think this is the way to go. I just do. The rewards are just incalculable. It's amazing. And what would I say to somebody? All right, this is what I say. The leap is much worse than the landing. It's really scary to jump right in, but it's a soft landing. So I just think that this is the greatest thing. And I'm planning to take more cases because I'm like totally committed to this. And it's fun. It's frustrating. And to me particularly, it can be frustrating because I'm on the other side of the government now. And there are definitely mornings like this morning where I would say, if one of my staff had ever done that, I never would have tolerated it. because they can be impervious, and I think that's the right word. They're very arrogant at times, and they're very stubborn, and it's very frustrating dealing with them. And if they're treating us this way, just think about how they treat your client. And so it's a really good feeling to be able to help people who can't help themselves.
Well, Rosemary, thank you so much for both your time on this webinar and for the work that you've done for the detained population at Otay Mesa. And to the 80 odd participants in this webinar, I look forward to meeting you when you take a case with IJP. Thanks.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this.
Thank you so much, both of you. Really appreciate it. And Rosemary, before you fully go, there's one question. How long have you been doing this volunteer work? Questions for you from a participant.
I think I'm at 7 months.
7 months. Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. A little more about ProBAR before we get into our next conversation with pro bono volunteer Dan. As I mentioned before, I'm pro bono counsel for the ABA's Commission on Immigration. I have the fortune of not being based in Washington, D.C. or Chicago, Illinois, where it's going to be quite too cold, among other things. And I'm actually based at ProBAR. And ProBAR is the oldest of the ABA's Commission on Immigration projects. It's based in Harlingen, Texas, which is in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas along the U.S. Mexico border. It also happens to be where I was born and raised. ProBAR has been around we're going on to our 31st year. It is the pro bono asylum representation project. And ProBAR provides legal services to both detained adults and unaccompanied migrant children. And so the organization really provides services, and it's one of the only ones that does both for both adults, adult migrants and asylum seekers, as well as unaccompanied children. The pro bono program at ProBAR has largely been focused on the adults, where representation is very lacking. And my conversation with Dan today is going to be about a case that he worked with a team at Simpson Thacher. So Dan, welcome, and we'll just launch into some of the questions.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you worked on a team to represent one asylum seeker in his merits case. The representation started before the pandemic, but the case continued after the pandemic had began. But before we get into the specifics of that and the impact of the representation due to the pandemic, can you tell us a little bit more about the client and the claim?
Yeah, absolutely. So our client was a young man from Guatemala. He grew up and spent most of his life in a pretty rural area, sort of on the far outskirts of Guatemala City. And I mean, a lot of his life, was spent, he didn't realize, I guess, until a little bit later in his life, that he was a gay man, which, just sort of brought upon him all sorts of terrible abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual assault, community stigma. He endured it all, and it was incredibly hard for him there. And things escalated to the point that he fled to the United States. And before we were involved in the case back in 2016, and he was apprehended at the border and deported. And then he moved back in with, his family back in his small town outside of Guatemala City, and things only really got worse for him. People in the community learned of his sexual orientation, which, he was completely ostracized, and, subjected to some terrible violence. Frankly, he was beaten to within an inch of his life on multiple occasions. He was again sort of more scared for his life than he ever was before he came back to the United States. He was again apprehended at the border. And sort of the difficulty was because he had a prior removal, he wasn't really, we sort of tacked on an asylum claim into our case materials, but we ended up waiving that sort of as a show of good faith with the judge, which I think he appreciated. And we ended up pursuing a withholding of removal claim instead, but which is a little bit different standard. I think it was a slightly tougher for us to meet, but fortunately we were able to do it. In this case, I mean, I think our client was, he was able to tell his story, I think, so clearly, and it came across sort of so honestly that I think really all credit goes to him in the result. But I think, we sort of able to move the papers along for him, but it was, incredibly rewarding.
Thanks, Dan. Now, there were 3 hearings, if I recall correctly, for the merits case, and the last one was telephonic. And Rosemary spoke a little bit about her experience with a telephonic hearing. What were some of the mechanics of appearing via telephone for hearing? I believe it happened in April, which was you're in New York, and in the throes of the pandemic. So how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, it was okay. It went relatively smoothly, actually. We were completely terrified for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think, as Rosemary mentioned, you lose a lot of things in the telephonic hearing. You can't see the judge. I think one concern that we had with how long our case ended up stretching, we had multiple continuances to, just for time constraints. I think at one point the judge had to cut us off at noon after our client had done his direct, but before cross, because he had to go do, his remain in Mexico docket, which sort of, I guess, refreshingly, he was very unhappy about. And then, so then that was another several months before our next hearing, and then we had cross, and then it was the judge wanted both sides to gather additional evidence. So then it was, another continuance for several months until the hearing that was delayed for some reason, and ultimately we had to take telephonically. So I mean, part of what we lost in the telephonic hearing was compounded by just the delays, which I think is the emotional resonance of our client's story, which I think was absolutely critical in getting withholding granted here. He hadn't been in front of the judge, and I think it was December. We had the last hearing in April. So you have a judge who sees a lot of cases. You have a judge who denies almost all of those cases. I think when we had been in there in person, it really, it's hard to read, but it seemed like the judge was getting it. He was sort of understanding the claims, and he seemed, to think that our client was trustworthy, which is, a big barrier in some of these cases. And you don't have that as much in the telephonic hearing. But, I guess it turned out okay, because, the telephonic hearing is the one that we were ultimately granted the good result in. But yeah, it was April, I think, 7th, and I think the day before we were planning to go down until, pretty close to the time. Nothing was shut down in Texas. The PIDC was open still. Everything was shut down in New York. But we ended up moving to participate telephonically, I think, on the day before the hearing. And it was granted. We found a helpful clerk in the office who helped us, file things electronically, which is sometimes hard to do. But I think as far as, I think I would just echo what Rosemary said, is that, it's tough to read the room, and it's not quite as effective, but, in some ways that's helpful. You can more freely communicate, I guess, with we had 3 people there from Simpson, so we could, sort of more openly talk to each other about what to say next, what the judge was thinking. Whereas, if you're in the hearing in person, you can't do that. So, I guess that's one pro I would add.
And even though you were remote on the telephone and you probably couldn't speak with your client while the hearing on, at least directly, you can lean over and talk to your client. But that's where you got the grant. The judge issued the decision. What did that feel like to win relief for your client?
Oh, it was amazing. It was a great feeling. It's it's a different feeling than you get in my normal practice, which is mostly, in the antitrust space. And it was fantastic. I think, it was the most excited that we've ever heard our client. He was thrilled. I mean, he had been in detention for I think May 19 to April 2020. And I mean, he was so terrified of going back to Guatemala that he was basically, we would talk to him and we'd have to break the news that his case was being continued for another 3 months again, because the judge was on vacation or whatever. And he was fine with it. He was, obviously he didn't like being in PIDC, but he was happier there than going back to Guatemala. So, that's sort of how much he did not want to leave. He'd rather just stay in detention indefinitely than have to go back. But, obviously, being able to tell him that we won was amazing. We weren't there in person, unfortunately. That was definitely a little bit devastating, but I think, it was still a very happy occasion, but it would have been great to be there in person too.
Mm-hmm. Now, studies show that about 14% of detained asylum seekers have legal representation. The immigration judge that presided over your case has a denial rate of 89.2% for asylum cases. This is according to data from Syracuse University and covers 241 cases during a 5-year period. Given those odds, what do you think was most important to securing a win? You talked a little bit about the client and how the client testified and his ability to speak to the horrific situation that happened to him, persecution that happened to him in Guatemala based on his sexual orientation. But, that's a pretty high denial rate. So, you talked about the papers, but, in all that and your interactions with the judge, what do you think was most critical in the representation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, trying to go through that process without representation, I mean, it was an 11-month process for us. We gathered, a number of affidavits from Honduras and from Guatemala. We were able to have a country conditions expert come speak to LGBT conditions in Guatemala. We had another person, provide a psychological evaluation for the client. I mean, all that is just kind of stuff that'd be very difficult to do without any counsel who knows where to look for such things. But I think another thing that's critical is just, having somebody there who, I was going to say prior experience. I didn't actually have any prior experience with this process, but sort of the firm as an institution and ProBAR obviously have been through this many times and could give guidance. And we have experience in the sort of general litigation context. And I mean, I think one thing that was hard and is hard if you've never, been up and been examined or been cross-examined in a deposition or what have you is being clear and telling your story and, hitting sort of the main themes and not knowing what's important and what's not, something you need to do a long exposition about. And so I think, before each of the hearings, we went in person and spent a few hours with our client. In the detention center has sort of breakout rooms that are, semi-jail, semi-conference rooms. And, we were able to sort of go through what would happen the next day there, sort of refresh him on what what he had in his materials and sort of go through the sort of the main themes to hit on and come back to and he had a tendency to go on long tangents about things that weren't necessarily relevant, but he had no real way of knowing that. And I think bringing the ability and just having been through the process before to help him was critical. So I mean, I'm not surprised, I guess, that the denial rate is so high, just because of how involved this process of seeking asylum can be. I mean, it was a lot of work, really rewarding work, but it was definitely it was a long process.
Right. Thank you. Now, Rosemary spoke a little bit about her experience as a solo practitioner. She's retired as well. Can you share with the participants about what this pro bono experience meant to you as an associate, as your firm, and how has it impacted your perspective of how you are going to do pro bono work for your legal career?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's a little similar to Rosemary. Obviously, I'm earlier in my career, but I'm also sort of like her early in my career in sort of figuring out what I want to do, on a sort of a volunteer and pro bono work basis. And I think this is definitely something I want to do. I've done some sort of asylum adjacent things previously, and it's just, there's really no better reward than getting a good outcome in a case like this, and you can keep in touch with your client, and it's great to see their progress after you get these good results, and even though I guess if it doesn't turn out well, at least you've given them their fair day in court and guided them through the process, which, like I said, can be overwhelming to the unrepresented. So I mean, I think this is definitely, asylum is incredibly rewarding, and something that I want to make part of my practice going forward. It's also, I guess for a young attorney, if anybody's thinking about ways to build skills, I mean, that's sort of an added benefit. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, you're in person, you're doing, you're interviewing clients, you're dealing with the judge, you're on your feet, you're objecting. It's a good sort of proxy for an in-court experience. It's sort of good in that way, in addition to, good writing development. There's definitely a brief writing component to all of this. It's not so heavy on the law. There's a little law, but it's incredibly factual. But I think that's very worthwhile as well, to developing new skills for a young attorney.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to see if, from the ABA's sort of 50,000-foot perspective, Judy Perry Martinez is still with us here. Judy, you just heard some fantastic feedback from pro bono attorneys working in Southern California and New York border. What do you see? What is your response to these pro bono efforts?
Well, Lara, I mean, to say the least, the kind of commitment that we've seen out of small firms, solo practitioners, lawyers in their more senior retired years, and young lawyers and even law students who've pitched in along with their staff it's breathtaking. And this is what the American Bar Association is all about, whether it's in this field or another field, but this one presents an extraordinary demonstration of what commitment to being a lawyer is all about. I can tell you that in 2018, before I started my year as president-elect of the American Bar, then President Bob Carlson and I went down together to spend a week doing work at ProBAR. And going into the detention centers changed what we knew we had to do in speaking out on immigration issues. And it fueled us because of the firsthand witnessing that we had an opportunity to engage in and to hear these stories. We heard a few minutes ago, the notions of just being there for somebody to be able to tell their story. And lawyers are trained listeners, and to help them understand that somebody is there with them listening is powerful. I went back again in August of 2019 as I started my year as president, and brought with me Trish Rifo, who's now the current president of the ABA. And we spent a week. And again, it reaffirmed what we know that we have to do on the policy front for the American Bar Association with the extraordinary talents like Meredith and Jenny Needler and others who work on the policy front, and you, Laura, have even testified before Congress on these important issues. But I want to go to one certain point. It is remarkable what a difference a lawyer can make. But it's not only about the outcome, which is what we all strive for. It is about being there for people who would otherwise be alone, as both Rosemary and Dan have alluded to. It is about justice, and that component of justice is reputation. And so you are helping to deliver justice, even if you don't succeed under these very difficult, on these very difficult cases. And so don't ever be afraid to try. And that's, I think, the most important message that I can share with you, having done pro bono work. The people who do this work every day fail in terms of not having the outcomes they always want, or the optimal outcomes they want. Those in the front line, and they get up each and every day and do it again and again and again. And so we pro bono lawyers have to do the same. We have to dive in, like Rosemary said, and know that we're going to have partners like Dan and you, like Kai and you on the front lines with us, and take the chance, take the risk that maybe we'll be helping somebody to get to the outcome they want. But even if not, that we've been there with them as they had their journey along the way.
Thank you so much, Judy. And for those attendees, at the highest levels of the ABA, we don't just talk the talk, we walk the walk. Judy sat next to me as we interviewed a separated father who several months later was reunified with his 18-month-old boy. And so this comes from a real place of knowing what the legal profession can bring to people's lives, and make sure that that we are a nation of laws and that people do have their rights enforced, and that's what we do. Thank you so much for chiming in, Judy. I know that was a little unplanned, really appreciate it. There's a couple of questions that I just want to acknowledge before we turn to Sela, to Laura Egan, who's going to talk a little bit more about unaccompanied migrant children. And I'm going to acknowledge these questions, but then we're going to come back to them. And so one of the questions was, how has COVID impacted your ability to communicate with your client in detention? I'm going to have Rosemary and Dan maybe chat a little bit about it at the end if we have time. And the other was about experts. Did the experts work on pro bono basis? I think those are fantastic questions that we'll also talk about. There was a question from a student too. We love students, so if we have time, we'll talk about how students can get engaged as well. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Laura, to talk a little bit about SELA and the pro bono opportunities.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let me get that set up. Okay, so you can see that. So thank you again. My name is Laura Egan, and I'm a senior staff attorney with SELA, the Children's Immigration Law Academy. We're based in Houston. So thank you again for joining us today to help celebrate Pro Bono Week and learn more about the ABA Project's pro bono work. We really appreciate you guys being here. For my presentation today, I'm going to go over some information about SELA and our services, why I'd ask that you consider pro bono opportunities working with children in immigration cases. I'll go over SELA's pro bono platform and also ways to get connected with SELA. So SELA is a unique organization in that we are a legal resource center. We are a capacity building organization, so we are helping support attorneys on the ground working at nonprofit organizations and pro bono attorneys who work with children and youth in immigration cases. We don't think children should have to go to court alone, and that's a primary reason why we're doing this work. We have a small but mighty team of 6. Dahlia is the director of SELA. We are an attorney-heavy team. Our team of attorneys bring a deep knowledge base and diverse backgrounds in child advocacy, removal defense, immigration, family, and administrative law. We also have experience as pro bono attorneys ourselves, pro bono coordinators, and managers of nonprofits working with children in immigration law. SELA works both nationally and specifically in Texas, depending on the service. We create resources and trainings to help guide attorneys in this work. And we have our pro bono projects, which I'm going to talk more about today. We also answer technical assistance questions for practitioners in Texas. So these can be case-specific questions regarding substantive law or strategy. We do that again for attorneys on the ground as well as pro bono attorneys. We also host 5 working groups to support collaboration and to go over substantive areas of law like asylum and special immigrant juvenile status. In prior years, when needed, we have provided support to legal service providers at emergency reception centers, ERCs. So when there's an urgent need, SELA really tries to step up and support the nonprofits on the ground in any way that we can. So children are not entitled to free appointed legal counsel in immigration cases. So even though there are many organizations around the country doing this work, this slide shows some of those, there's not enough to meet the need. And organizations work with unaccompanied children in their cases through direct representation and also by working with pro bono attorneys to help meet that need. At SELA, we refer to the people doing this work as unaccompanied children's champions because they are helping guide children through legal procedures with courage, competency, compassion, and creativity. So they're working to navigate the system, but also push back when necessary, and continuing to work towards justice for these kids and youth. The need is really greater than the network of nonprofits can provide, which is why pro bono assistance is often necessary. And some organizations are working to find pro bono attorneys in their local areas, while others may be trying to connect a child to an attorney if they've moved to a different state, for example. Also, not every state has a nonprofit organization doing this work. So in those regions or areas, there's even a greater need for a pro bono attorney to step in. Since children are not entitled to free appointed legal counsel in immigration cases, many end up without an attorney by their side. In immigration law, the odds are stacked against people as it is right now. Consider a child or a teenager who has just left everything that they know, and they have to now navigate the American immigration legal system. I mean, it's really just an impossible situation, and an attorney and advocate is really essential. So we often look at this data tool from Syracuse University called TRACK, and the data just shows that most juveniles, more than half, do not have representation. And looking at pending cases of juveniles in immigration court today, there are over 350,000 cases pending without representation. So this just shows how great a need there really is. And while we think that no doubt that the best gold standard would be appointing a free specialized attorney to every child in the system, until that standard is realized, many children are going to need help from attorneys on a pro bono basis to fill that gap. There are ways to help children facing deportation in communities across the entire country and probably where you live as well. So SELA is involved in pro bono work for a few reasons. And first being, we think every child should have representation. We really know the difference having an attorney can have in a case for the child and for the outcome of the matter. And this chart shows a breakdown of cases that were granted relief and whether they had representation or not. And it's clear that representation made a difference. Few are able to succeed without it. And this has been talked about today, and I'm so glad that it has, because while case outcomes are important, that's not all there is. Having someone listen to you, to be by your side when you're doing something that's hard and scary, to have your back, to explain what is going on, to explain your options. I mean, this is really important to people, to adults, but also to children and teenagers. And so it's more than just about winning or losing, but to have someone with you to accompany these kids on their journey of trying to get relief, to get protection and safety in the United States. I also wanted to highlight a video that's created by the Commission on Immigration called Tu Futuro, Tu Voz, Your Future, Your Voice. It's short, it's only 14 minutes, too long for me to show today, but short enough to watch during a break that you may have later this week. And it features 4 young adults who came to the United States as unaccompanied children. And you can hear a little bit about their journeys, their experience working on their cases. It's really a video that was created for other youth, but I find it just very inspiring. And I think it will give you kind of a glimpse into this work. And also you'll be able to hear from these now young adults, but those who were once unaccompanied children themselves, and just hear hear from them directly. And so I think it's really powerful, and I encourage you to watch it. I think we're going to include the links as well, so you can watch that later on. So as I mentioned, SELA is a legal resource center, and we are a capacity building organization. We're here to help and support those doing this work. And so something we do is we create written resources, guides, we host webinars and trainings, and we have so much information and material on our website, material that you can watch and get for free. And even some of the prior webinars, those that are most recent, you might be able to get Texas CLE credit for. So if that's something that's of interest to you, you could look for that specifically. But there's a wealth of information up there, and I encourage you to check it out if you're in the field or if you're interested in taking a case on a pro bono basis, because these materials may help you know how to learn to work with children, how to work in immigration law specifically, or just if you're interested. But also, I want to highlight that recently in August 2020, we released our pro bono guide, and it's 101 pages. It gives a lot of really great information about how to work with children in a way that's going to be effective. It provides nuts and bolts information regarding several forms of legal relief, what to expect in immigration court if your client is in removal proceedings, what to expect for a USCIS interview if your client has an interview scheduled. And we give links where you can learn more as you continue to work on your case. So it's really a great resource and tool. I encourage you to check it out. You can download it again for free on our website, and I think we'll include a link to that as well, so you have easy access. So I've gone over who SELA is and how we can help pro bono attorneys working with children through all our resources and trainings available. And I've gone over that there's a great need. So you might be wondering, how do I get involved? And SELA has a pro bono platform called Pro Bono Matters for Children Facing Deportation, where we connect with legal service providers to post cases that need representation. So I think the easiest way to explain it is it acts kind of like a bulletin board for the organizations to post their cases. We are working with 12 organizations currently across the country, so there are opportunities from several states. And this is a place where pro bono attorneys who are interested in this type of work can go, read some information about the available cases, and express interest. So our goal here is really just to help match more pro bono attorneys with these organizations so that more kids can have representation. SELA is a bridge in this way, since we host the platform, but you will really directly work with the organization that posted the case. Sometimes SELA also posts opportunities. Our opportunities are typically for legal research, and so you might see sometimes an opportunity there as well to volunteer with SELA directly. I want to go over how to use the platform. And so you're going to find the platform on SELA's website, and we'll provide that information. And when you look at it, you'll see these case cards posted, and they will provide a short description, organization's name. So here's just an image of a couple case cards. And each organization manages their pro bono program differently. So some cases will say that mentorship is available, or others may say remote opportunity. So it's going to depend on the organization and the type of opportunity that's posted, but you can look for those if that's something that you're looking for. And the first step is really just to go to the website, to that platform page, and look around. You can use the search function, or you can just peruse the cases that are posted. There are 28 cases posted on the platform as of today. And there are a lot of people on this webinar. There's others who may be watching it later as well. And we would really love to see some of those cases placed with an attorney. So that would be really amazing. The next step is, if you see a case that looks interesting, you just click on that button that says interested, and then you'll see a pop-up, and that pop-up asks for your name, your email address, and phone number. So you have to include that contact information so the organization has a way to reach out to you. They'll gather more information from you, likely share information about the opportunity. On there also says bar number and comment, and that's optional, but I will just say that's really helpful information to include for the organization. That way they just have it off the bat, and they kind of have a little bit more information about you and why you're interested. There's also an option where you can share the opportunity with a friend or colleague. So there's just a button on the right-hand corner that says share, And so if you click on that, it will give you a link to that specific case card that you can send to a colleague or friend. And so that's really helpful too. If you know somebody that's interested in working with kids, children's rights, family law, immigration law, if you know somebody that's in that particular region where that case is, go ahead and share that. So it's just really simple, 1, 2, 3. Really from there, the organization who posted the opportunity, they're going to get an email with your contact information so they can reach out to you directly. You can respond, learn more about the opportunity, learn more about the organization and their process, and get started. And so, again, we're just really grateful for your pro bono work. If you've already engaged, we're thankful for your interest in being here today to help celebrate Pro Bono Week, and really grateful for helping us achieve one of our goals to have more representation for kids and youth. So thank you. Now I'll just go over to my next slide here, just in terms of how to stay connected with CELA. So check out CELA's platform, express interest in a case, maybe share another case with a friend. That would be great. And then also join CELA's newsletter. It's a quarterly newsletter, and we're sending this to attorneys who are pro bono attorneys, those who are interested in a case, maybe taking a case down the line in the future, or somebody that just wants to learn more and see some of CELA's resources. You can join our newsletter by just doing the simple survey. We'll add you to our list, we'll send it out quarterly, and then you can be connected. Additionally, check out our website to learn more about us and to view some of the resources. Maybe the pro bono guide or a webinar on how to work with experts, for example. That was one of our recent ones that's posted. We also recently posted a blog post about how border policies post COVID-19 are impacting unaccompanied children. So that's very timely and something that you might want to read just to have a better understanding of what's going on right now. So thank you again, and I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I was posting the links to all panelists and attendees as you are speaking. So they were getting the links as you mentioned it. So feel free to click away now, save them later, but check them out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We do have a few minutes left. So with the remainder time, I'm actually going to, speaking of how to stay in touch, how to get engaged, for those of you who were really compelled and maybe are interested in volunteering with the organization that's based out of San Diego, that is the Immigration Justice Project. I'm going to include a link, and that's a survey that you just fill out, and one of the pro bono attorneys or assistants will reach out to you with the opportunities available to volunteer, just like Rosemary's been volunteering. Again, with IJP, there is mentorship associated that's provided by the Justice Campaign. The Justice Campaign has a similar name, so it can be a little confusing, but it is a separate organization that provides that really fantastic mentorship. And I'm going to include information on the links about that, as information in the way of links about the Justice Campaign as well. For those of you that are interested in maybe in the South Texas border and volunteering with ProBAR, I'm going to include another survey. We've got lots of surveys here, but click on that link that I just put into the chat to work with ProBAR, to volunteer with ProBAR in Harlingen, Texas. Fill out that survey and we will get in touch with you. You don't need to, in order to do this work, you actually don't need to be an active attorney. Okay, so, Rosemary was in retirement. So we work with a variety of different volunteers, attorneys, non-attorneys. There was a question about translations, and so we do, at times need assistance with translation of documents. So there's a wide variety of volunteer opportunities. Most of them are legal for attorneys, but not all of them. So feel free to click on those links. Now, for some questions, I was wondering if maybe our panelists could turn on their video cameras. We do have just a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up. And one of the questions was about COVID-19, and I think it's a great one. How has COVID-19 affected your ability to communicate or consult with your client who is in detention? Was it difficult for you to set up times to communicate with your client in detention? So maybe we can go to, let's see, Kai, do you want to give maybe a staff perspective, somebody who's working in detention centers a lot, and then maybe Rosemary and Dan can chime in with what their experience was?
Sure. It's candidly been an obstacle. Some more streamlined procedures are now, what are we, like 8 months out, beginning to emerge. There, as Rosemary alluded to, is always the option of a detainee calling out to their lawyer, but I believe it costs about $1 a minute for them to do that. So that's, you know, suboptimal for obvious reasons. I've heard rumors, but have yet to see confirmation that if the detainee gives ICE the phone number of their attorney, they will make it so that they have free outgoing calls to their attorney. Again, that sounds good. I've yet to see that happen in practice, but still that's far from ideal, because you have folks calling their attorneys from like a not at all confidential area where they're detained and potentially discussing, you know, highly sensitive information within earshot of other detainees and detention center staff. I've had some luck in, I'm really grateful, in fact, the staff at Otay Mesa, the legal visit staff, has been pretty good at helping me find time where they can bring one of my clients up to the legal visitation area and have them call me free and confidentially from one of the legal visitation rooms. But the only hitch there is that I'm always just penciled in, because they have to give priority to asylum interviews and also to people who are in the custody of the U.S. Marshals to meet with their criminal defense counsel because of Sixth Amendment reasons.
Thanks, Kai. That was very in-depth, and you know, you're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. For volunteers, you know, and what Kai really pointed out was free, confidential calls, right? So that, you know, clients are supposed to have access to free, confidential legal calls. That can be a challenge. Dan and then Rosemary, how did you handle this?
So we didn't come up against too much of the COVID difficulties. Our case actually wrapped up while Harlingen was, you know, it was sort of prior to it being hit. So in that sense, we didn't really run up against this difficulty in communicating with the client, with the exception of, you know, we couldn't prep him for our final hearing in person. But as far as making calls, we were able to sort of prepay a small amount of money so that, you know, we could facilitate communications more easily from PIDC to us, which mostly we initiated. And then he was, you know, we'd sort of just give him a time that we would call, and he would expect to hear from us then. So I don't know that I have too much to say about how much that has changed and how much more difficult that has become now, but I'm sure it has.
Right. Rosemary, do you want to give a little bit of your experience?
Well, sure. I think that the problem with setting up attorney calls is depends on who you set it up with. So there have been times when they wouldn't commit to a day or a time, and then you're sort of on call. I remember the first time I was on call for like 48 hours. I couldn't go anywhere without my phone. It was horrible. Now they seem to have gotten a little bit better, and I can get it narrowed down to a time, but it doesn't always work. So I was going to prep my witness and set up an attorney call with him, and for the hearing last Friday, and they didn't get him up before the count. And if you don't get him up before the count, then you're out of luck. And so we were out of luck, and we were confined to a 10-minute call. So prepping was done very quickly. And I think it requires a certain degree of savviness on the part of the client, because one client seems to follow the rules, and I get a 10-minute call with him, and that's it. My other client, I don't know what he does, but he manages to get these 10-minute calls that go on for an hour. And I haven't figured out how he does that.
Right. I think the moral of the story in access to clients, it's going to vary. It's going to vary by detention center. Sometimes, and when you get into this, the fascinating realm of representation in the immigration space, it varies even by officer. And just like judges, you know, depending on what they ate for breakfast this morning, only a little different, right? So you can get some variance in the application of the rules. I will say at a level of due process, this is an issue that the ABA has looked into with its projects and making sure that attorneys do have access to their clients and that free, confidential legal calls are available. But it is something that, you know, it requires persistence. And so I would say that is a commonality. Another question about experts. For those who utilized experts, and it sounds like Rosemary, you had an expert write a declaration for a parole package, and Dan, I believe you had an expert for the merits case. Did those experts provide their assessments on a pro bono basis, or were they paid?
Well, so ours were paid. I would say that they sort of gave us a discounted rate from what they normally do, but it wasn't fully pro bono. That's not to say that there aren't scenarios where perhaps they would offer services fully pro bono. I mean, we were reaching out from a large law firm, so maybe not in that case. And fortunately, the firm was able to pay them. So in that case, they were paid. I mean, I think another part of the question I saw was, where did we find them? I mean, that's tough. We were working on really short notice. So, I mean, we reached out to a few. I mean, our country conditions expert, we, for various reasons, had to find a new one at a very short notice. And we sort of just found that expert off of one of the listed various, you know, asylum organizations maintain online. I mean, I think if you Google around, you can find a lot of good examples. I think our other expert, ProBAR, was able to recommend somebody who had worked in cases in the past and was local and really was super helpful. So, I mean, I think just mining, you know, if you have any, you know, if the organization you're working with has any recommendations, that's helpful. And failing that, frankly, just the lists of people who put their names out there to advertise themselves for these kind of cases can be helpful too.
Rosemary, do you just briefly want to address the, I think it was a doctor who provided an assessment, a medical expert?
Right. Actually two. The doctors and the medical schools, I got the contacts from IJP and reached out to them, and they were free. On the client who's been tortured, IJP also connected me with survivors of torture, and they gave me a letter also for free to support the bond hearing and the parole release.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosemary. An anonymous attendee asked, how much of a pro bono's attorney's funds should be budgeted for these cases? I will say we do not require any funds to be put towards these cases. You know, and we wanted sort of a different perspective. Some law firms take this as an opportunity to, you know, invest in the cases, and they litigate them how they would litigate other cases. Solo practitioners, it's different, right? And so there is no expectation that an attorney, you know, put any amount of money. We work in a nonprofit space, and so we try, and as Rosemary mentioned, the organizations on the ground do have contacts, they do have networks, law clinics, you know, depending on whatever it is that you need to support the case, we try and find that without the association of any funds. So I did want to say that. We have just a few minutes left. There is a very technical question about unaccompanied children that I'm going to turn to our expert from CELA about. Laura, this question is about a specific policy issued removing the requirement for immigration judges to employ child-sensitive procedures and child-appropriate hearing environments. So this is an issue that the ABA has tracked closely, but do you want to respond briefly to that question?
Yes, sure. And so I think the question is referring to Operating Policies and Procedure Memorandum 17-03, just in case people are interested and not familiar with it. You're right in that, this was a policy memorandum that replaced a prior policy that was more friendly, more favorable for kids. And so I guess I'll just say that, it is disappointing when these kinds of policy memorandums are issued and stripping rights away and abilities of judges away to have control over their courtroom. I will also say that again, it's going to depend per judge. I think judges have still a lot of control and power over how they conduct their hearings and their demeanor and their pace, and those things are really important on all hearings, but also particularly when working with children. Whether you have a judge who just gives baseline respect, to your client or not, that's something you're going to observe when you're in a courtroom. And so, while this was certainly a policy memorandum that impacted the work, there's still arguments you can make based off of it that procedures should be age appropriate. There's still arguments you can make in this situation that maybe a child should have a chance to go to the hearing room in advance and get a little bit more comfortable. Maybe you can ask the judge to take off their robe and just have normal clothing on, just to be a little bit less intimidating, or bring a teddy bear. There's still certain things you could ask for your client to be able to do, depending on the age of the child, their competency level, their comfort level, their experiences, what story do they have, what are they going to be having to talk about. So I'll also just say, this is not the only policy that's making life more challenging for us, and CELA has a document, Asylum Law Under Attack. What is the impact on unaccompanied children? And it goes through just the most recent attacks on asylum law and how it's impacting kids. And so this kind of thing keeps happening, and we have to just keep pushing back and keep advocating the best that we can for our clients, children and adults. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for the question, and Laura for the answer. In wrapping up, there were a few questions about malpractice insurance and professional liability coverage. I do want to say that Immigration Justice Project, where Kai is based in San Diego, as well as ProBAR based in Harlingen, Texas, depending on the case matter and depending on how you partner with the organization, they do provide malpractice insurance, but it is a case-by-case conversation that the volunteer has with the organization on the ground. Before you take your case, before you get your mentor, before you really dive in deep. That way everybody makes sure and understands where that's going to be covered and who is going to be covered, and what the obligations are. So that is, and actually not all organizations do that. So it is definitely a benefit to volunteer with both IJP and ProBAR. Everyone, happy National Celebration of Pro Bono Week. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to see your email and when you sign up for ProBAR or IJP or CELA. Judy, do you want to close us out?
I'll just say that take the opportunity that the holidays approaching to share your stories with people beyond the legal profession, as well as with your colleagues where you work every day. People need to understand how committed you are, and once they do, they will come in droves, I believe, to do more pro bono work, because they will have the opportunity to work with Laura and Laura and Jenny and Allie and Kai, and tremendous professionals who dedicate their lives to this critical access to justice work.